And looking at the streets as a section, what do we actually experience most as a pedestrian on the streets? We experience most the city at eye level. This is a program that started by a company in the Netherlands, by Stipo, and they focus a lot on not only the streets, but also the plinth, which means that the ground floor of a building gives about 90% of our experience. So that was really for me like something to dive deeper in, like what is the ground floor and the street? How is that relationship? And what is actually a good or an active ground floor and what is considered less? There's not a lot of research on this, but Konrad Kicker developed like a categorization of like the more active and the less active ground floors. And the more active ground floors actually give more value to the street. And that was interesting to find actually a master thesis study from KTH that focused just on the ground floors of Hornsgatan. And Erik found that 40% of the business has changed over a period of 5 years. So I figured there's a big change happening too. And from there, I started to wonder, so what are actually the details of, let's say, Hornsgatan in Stockholm? How many active ground floors do we find? What is the kind of public space quality here? What is this 90% of experience that we as pedestrians or, as inhabitants and residents see or visitors see, like at Hornsgatan? That's where I started off. And from there, I developed my own method and I built an impressive database of about 1,000, or I think it started off at like 800 ground floors. I did this quantitatively and I worked with statistical analysis, but I also added qualitative ethnographic observations. So I used Google Street View, and this was in 2018. So I looked back when the first Google car drove through the streets, which was in 2009. So I had a 10-year window to see what changed and how it changed. And I walked the street up and down just to verify and validate all these like little details. And I started off with 3 streets in the beginning, and I ended up with this massive Excel document that became my nightmare. I worked with these variables, storefront functions. So I created my own category and storefront ownership. And that is it a chain store or a local store? And then I also looked at the sizes of the ground floors because I thought that would be maybe interesting. And I found actually statistically significant relationships, and that was very nice to find. And also they corresponded across the 3 streets like almost neatly, which was an amazing finding. So almost 50% of the storefronts changed. So either only the storefront function, so from a clothing store, it became a hairdresser, but also a storefront owner. So it went from like a family business to a chain store. And what I found was that there are 2 categories that were increasing: food and drink services and personal beauty services, which also marks that there is an increase of services and a decrease of product stores. And then I found that the personal beauty services are often, I see that this error is a bit misplaced, but the personal beauty services are often run by sole traders and family businesses, whereas the food and drink services are often run by the sole traders, family businesses, and local companies. So the new kind of stores are often like small local independent stores. That's how they start. And they're often located in the small plates and the medium plates. So like up to 120 square meters. And Hornsgatan is a perfect street for that, for a store to start. Because 40% of the areas, the ground floors, are small areas. And the small ground floors actually change more radically. They're very flexible. They change from like maybe a chain clothing store to like a hairdresser, family business, something like that. Why are these actually relevant? So in 10 years' time, almost half of the ground floors changed. That gives an indication it's a very dynamic environment, and I found a significant relationship. And some of this is a bit redundant, but what I also found was that regional chain stores popped up. So they start with one, and then they sort of create new branches. And it's interesting, is that a sign of a valuable place for expansion, investment, and identity, but there might also be drawbacks, seeing the same thing over and over again. So can we say that there is a change towards retail gentrification? Seeing these regional chains, we can often see terms as like gentrifying hipsters or authenticity seeking or diversifying retail mix. Those are the terms actually that define very accurately the change that we are seeing. If we were to, describe like how are these main streets changing, these terms actually apply very well. And so I came across this term retail gentrification in literature and tried to see if that applies also to Stockholm. What it means is that it's a gentrification of commercial premises. And it's characterized by the direct and indirect displacement of traditional stores. And they're replaced by new retail spaces that aim for new and wealthier clientele. So how is this actually coming about? There is a retail change happening. A residential change, sorry. New people started to move into the area, and the consumption and lifestyle patterns that they bring prefer ABC category of storefronts. That's Sukin that developed that, art and boutiques and cafes. And I think we are all very familiar with that. And I think Hubert made a very valuable addition to that, to say there is then also a preference for healthier and greener authentic consumption choices. So that is like a change in like consumption behavior, perhaps. But on the other side, there's also global economy that plays a role in this. The retail capital that is developed based on like the concentration, the internationalization, and financialization of retail brings another kind of investment to gentrifying neighborhoods, and that instigates a process of retail gentrification. And what we then see is so-called upscaling retail. The new places that are establishing on main streets are in some way upscaling. It's a new kind of like more exclusive, or a service that wasn't there before, or wider availability, or there's more choice. It's just all a bit like up. That's what we are seeing. But trying to see if there's retail gentrification going on in Stockholm, it was kind of hard to find, like, how do you actually study this? So I found two indexes. Costa says there are more boutiques. There's a wider kind of ethnicity that you find, and more food services. And Sukin says there's new entrepreneurial retail capital in the form of boutiques. The more corporate retail capital in the form of chain stores, and what we see a decline of is old local retail that serves long-term residents. I tried to match this with my data that I had in this like wonderful Excel file, if you remember. And I found that I could work with food and drink services, as that was like a growing category, and also with the storefront ownership, that there is less of the old local retail and more chain stores coming up. And what I found was that the category food and drink services increased from 190 to 226 across 4 streets. And the storefront ownership is that The sole traders and family businesses decreased, local companies decreased, but instead we saw, what I found in my data is that there is an increase of regional, national, and international chain stores. So you could say there's an indication of retail gentrification. Knowing this, what is actually behind this change, or who can actually make a change here? I had a wonderful opportunity to walk with Sharon Zucking on Hornsgatan, and she pointed me to see who's actually the property owner here. Like, how is the rental situation actually happening? Because she wondered if in Stockholm business owners own their own storefront, and I said no, they're renting, and they're often renting from bostadsrättsföreningar, cooperative housing associations. So I'm trying to see on those 4 streets, I looked into the property data. So there were 907 storefronts and there are 294 property owners. I created this categorization and started to get interested in like the history of these cooperative housing associations establishing themselves during 1919 and 2010. And this was based on a political shift and an economic shift in the 1990s, where residents were able to buy their apartment at very low prices to become a member of their association. And this often took place in already attractive inner city areas. And this has sort of sped up and reinforced and spurred a residential gentrification process. And what is interesting is that almost half of these like 294 property owners are bostadsrättsföreningar. If you look at the pie chart on the top, the blue one are cooperatives. So almost half of the properties are owned by bostadsrättsföreningar. And this is more or less similar on all the 4 streets, with Hornsgatan being the extreme here. But you see that on the graph on the right side is that the rest of the property owners are nothing compared to the bostadsrättsförening, the cooperative housing associations. And when did this start, I wondered. So most of those associations were established between 1999 and 2008, which was, let's say, 10 to 20 years before I started to have my data from 2009. And I figured that the rental agreements from those bostadsrättsföreningar, from those associations with their tenants on the ground floors would have had at least 10 years and would have been renewed, where rent increase could have occurred. So I try to see what the ground floor changes have been specifically under the cooperative housing associations. And I could see that the increase in categories such as food and drink services, but also the highest decreasing category, retail product stores, was even more under a cooperative. So in some way there was like the change that we already saw in like the average of all the property owners was sort of amplified on the cooperative housing associations, what you see on the left. And on the right side, the same occurs actually. So you see that the regional chains have almost like doubled in under cooperative housing associations. The pink bar. So it was interesting to see, to have all the property owners and then the ground floors, and to zoom in on the associations and see that the ground floor change that was already happening is actually happening on like a bigger scale under just associations.